Very good. We are live. Hello, everybody. I see that Julian is there. Julian, would you give me a thumbs up or something if you can hear my voice? I have a new computer, which I'm using my Surface that I got, which actually is working flawlessly, so I'm really excited about that. But I just want to make sure I've got everything working. And that's it. We'll jump right in with a prayer. And then we'll get started with the introduction to the Gospel of John. I've got a couple here, so I'll be looking up at them a lot too as we go back and forth. And we'll get started. Perfect, Anita. Thank you very much. So we will get started with our Bible study for the year. Welcome. Shine within our hearts, living Master, of pure light of divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds for the understanding of your gospel teachings. And instill within us also the reverence for your blessed commandments, having trampled upon carnal desires. We may enter into a spiritual way of living, both thinking and doing all those things well pleasing to you. For you, Christ, our God, our sanctification and illumination, to you we give glory, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, now and forever in the ages of ages. Amen. Amen. Very good. Wonderful. So it is very good to be starting up again. It's funny because here in this room, the corner is really dark because I don't know if the lights are burnt out or if they're just not on.
They're not on. Can we turn it on?
Are they? Can you turn them on?
Sure.
Are they separate lights? They're the same lights. There's only one light switch over here, right?
Yeah, there's two.
Well, that's for the that's for that over there.
Let me try it.
Okay, you can try it. But I think it's just that these are out. I think they turn them out. So out there it's really bright, and over here it's really dark, which probably fits right in with John's gospel. The light with the so it makes me the dark. I'm sorry. So no, that's okay. Thanks. So the first thing I do is kind of my way of. It's probably a passive way of me showing off, but I want you guys to know what I'm doing and where this is coming from. So it's not just me saying, this is what I think the Bible means, that we need to be grounded within the tradition of the church. We need to be grounded in what the church fathers have taught. And then we also need to be engaged with kind of the contemporary scholarship. So at least we know what questions people are asking so we can direct them. So my little parade of books, we're going to use basically the same kinds of resources. I've got this one, which is N.T. Wright, which is he's an Anglican bishop. This is the one that gives a really good sense of the feel for the reading and kind of the flavor of it and what it sounds like and how it would have been received. It's a very good little devotional kind of commentary. And then the Orthodox, I have Father Lawrence Farley's, which basically kind of outlines it. It's kind of very straightforward, almost narrative expansion of what the gospel says. It just explains what's happening in the gospel. And then we have the Sacra Pagina, which is it's a more academic kind of one, but it comes from a Catholic perspective. But this one's really good for dealing with some of the language use and some of the criticism, that kind of stuff, the historical criticism. And then, of course, the other big technical one we have is the Word Biblical Commentary, which kind of comes from a more evangelical perspective or kind of Western Protestant idea. So some of the confessional commitments are a little bit off from our perspective, but then of course the bigger thing, it's a very technical one, so it actually goes into tracing a lot of the different movements in theology and the kind of questions that are being brought up, and so those are important things for us to be able to talk about. And then of course we always have Ancient Christian Commentary, which this one's really thick this time because the church fathers love the Gospel of John. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, but this basically surveys all the different church fathers. The Cappadocians wrote all about it. So you have St. Basil the Great, you have St. Gregory the theologian, St. Gregory of Nyssa. I also have the full commentary from St. Augustine and the full commentary from St. John Chrysostom, because both of them wrote commentaries on the Gospel of St. John. So that's a lot of the stuff I'm going to be going through. We also have the explanation of the Holy Gospel according to St. John by Blessed Theophylact, which is I think he's a Serbian Orthodox archbishop. But this is a more, again, Orthodox commentary that really talks about the spiritual aspect of things, so I can draw that out. And then special, just for us, just for this one, we have my class notes from seminary when I took a course, and Father Theodore Stylianopoulos gave a course on the Gospel according to St. John. So I've got that too, and I'm going to be referring to that quite a bit because he did a really good job on getting us grounded in it. So again, forgive me for my passive boasting, but also I do have a rhyme to the reason. I want you guys to understand what's gone into the background of this. So it's not just me reading and thinking, oh, gee, this is really interesting, I'm going to tell people about it. It really is kind of vetted and in conversation with a lot of different voices. And that's where we are. Questions? Very good. Okay, so here we are on the Gospel according to St. John. And there's really not as much introductory material as you'd have in some of the other Gospels. Whether or not this was really written by John was not really ever questioned in the ancient world. You know, the Gospel according to St. Mark, to St. Mark, is generally understood to be Peter's Gospel. But then it was written by John Mark as kind of his secretary. Now, is it Polychronius? I think there's St. John had an amanuensis, I can't ever even say the word, basically a secretary, who certainly wrote down the book of Revelation. And so that's where you get some language differences between the letters of St. John, the Gospel of St. John, and the book of Revelation. So some modern scholars have begun to question whether or not John really wrote the Gospel or not, and say that it's actually out of his school of thought. But there was a very common technique, I guess, even in the ancient world, that if you wanted to claim authority for a writing, you ascribed it to the originator of that school of thought. You know, so somebody who, a disciple of Marcus Aurelius would write a dissertation and say it was of Marcus Aurelius. And nobody in the ancient world thought that meant he really wrote it. So what that does, it complicates the scholarship around it, because just because it says it's by John didn't mean that the person writing it really expected us to believe it was by John. But the other side of that coin is the authorship has never really been questioned. It doesn't say in there, John wrote this, but it does identify the author of the gospel with the beloved disciple. Of course, it never says who the beloved disciple is, but there's a practice in ancient literature that author or highly respected people are not named by name. The other thing you'll notice in here is that John rarely uses the name of Mary. He generally says Jesus' mother or something like that. He doesn't really say Mary that often. This is where a lot of people look at it and say, oh, well, Jesus was disrespectful of Mary because he said, woman, here's this, and woman, that. But that's actually a literary device that shows respect. It's kind of ironic that it works that way. You'll also notice the name of John, as in the brother of James, does not show up very often in the gospel. It usually talks about the beloved disciple or the disciple that lay on the breast of Christ or whatever it was. So the indication is that it was, if not written and originated by John himself, it was certainly done by his disciples within his school of thought. In Orthodoxy, we've never really had a question. It was written by John. We kind of take it at face value. Aside from that, is it reflects what we know of John. And that's one of the neat things about Orthodoxy is John's not just a person, like there's a personality there, and you can kind of encounter him, which is a really neat experience too. So that's an aside though. As far as, you know, where it was written in the ancient world, it's generally thought to have been written at Ephesus when John was living there. That fits the feel of the writing. It's kind of it's a very interesting style because there's very much a Semitic kind of revelation in it. We'll see this in the very first verse, really. But it also is dealing with some fairly complex Greek, Hellenistic, philosophical kind of ideas like logos, which again we'll see in the very first verse. So this would seem to be some sort of a cosmopolitan area that had influences from not just the Greek cultural world, but also then the Israel and the kind of the Hebrew thought world. And Ephesus fits that really quite well. You know, even if we didn't have the tradition saying it was in Ephesus, it'd probably be one of the places somebody thought it might have been from. There's a little bit of debate about whether it was written before the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or if it was written after them. The general consensus, even among Orthodox scholars, is it was probably written after them, probably towards the end of the first century, so somewhere around 90 to 100 AD, something like that, which would kind of fit with the tradition the church has preserved. You know, the kind of John in his retirement went and wrote the gospel to capture as what he'd seen as an eyewitness. So those are kind of the big orienteering kind of, you know, getting us oriented to the gospel. Now, this gospel has always, and always, all the way back to Irenaeus, been understood as distinct from the other three. The other three have this very kind of tight connection. They're called synoptic, because you can lay them next to each other and they can follow along with some changes. But there's definitely a relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You can see how they're with each other. John, not at all. As a matter of fact, they're so distinct from each other you can't really tell if one was written before the other or not. That there's a lot of other kind of scholarly effort that goes into making that determination. And typically it's often called the mystical gospel. John makes no pretense that he's writing a historical document. He doesn't even try. What he's doing is he's writing a theological document. And he says at the very end of it, he says, so that you might know that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and he came into the world to save sinners. He doesn't say exactly those words, but he makes it entirely explicit that I'm writing this so that you will believe that Jesus is the Son of God. So everything he does is wrapped up in that. So sometimes there's going to be disagreements between the Synoptic Gospels and John. And people say, well, historically, what was the case? Well, generally, probably what the Synoptics said, because John very happily moves events around in order to fit a theological infrastructure. That's not dishonest. That's not untruthful. That's just, it's the genre of writing that it is. So we shouldn't expect it otherwise. For instance, the other Synoptic Gospels have Christ being crucified on, John has him crucified at the hour of sacrificing the Paschal lamb. That's probably not when he was crucified. But John has him crucified at that point because he's making the point, Jesus is the Paschal lamb. And so he needs that to fit very tightly in his narrative. So, but again, it brings up this question of, well, is it true? Well, if you mean, is it historically, chronologically, journalistically, expressed? No, it's not. It's true in the sense that a parable is true. There might be fictional elements, and I'm not even really sure I like using that word. There might be contrived elements. It might have been kind of put into a system in order to communicate an idea. Sometimes it's called symbolic. I don't like using that word because symbolic for us usually means that the reality is absent, and this is something that stands in for it. But in Orthodoxy, in kind of classical Christian thought, something that is a symbol is something that carried the reality of it in its presence. So like for us, it's easy because we talk about icons. An icon points towards the person depicted, but then it also somehow makes that person depicted present, not just in a metaphorical way, but in a very real, practical way. So in the same way, John, being a mystical gospel, makes Christ present, not just as an idea, but in a very real way. And John does that better than any of the other gospels. The other gospels can almost be read as a historical account or as a document, but you just can't read John that way, even not from the very first line. You're kind of like, okay, wait a second, this is different. I guess that's about it. John's interest isn't really so much in recording events, real events. His interest is in drawing out the meaning of those events. And so that's what we're going to see as we go through the gospel. Very good. I think that's everything. Any questions on that? Did I just hit that? I don't see any. Yay. Hello, everybody. Oh, Kendra's here. Very good to see you. Oh, no, I'm not recording. Do I have to record particularly? No, it records on its own. This one I don't have to record, but thank you, Julie. Often called mystical gospel. One of the first recent persons to write commentaries on the Gospel of John was Origen, who of course has been rejected as a heretic, so we have to be careful what we do with him. But most of the church fathers are very dependent on a lot of his exegesis and a lot of his Bible study. But he has two images, which I think the one, he says, the divine logos dwelling in the bosom of the Father. And we're going to hear that. That's coming up. But he says that the Son dwells in the bosom of the Father. That's a Semitic idiom for somebody being very intimately connected and close. And so that's a way of communicating how tightly bound and woven together the Son and the Father are. And obviously that has theological overtones to it. But we also have another person who lays at the breast in this gospel. And that's the beloved disciple. That's John himself, laying at the breast of Jesus on his bosom, at the mystical supper, the Last Supper. And so this image that Origen uses, he says, just as Jesus laid in the bosom of the Father, the Son laid in the bosom of the Father, and John laid in the bosom of Jesus, we should lay in the bosom of John and have that same intimate encounter with it, so that we can then have that kind of mediating, you have to be careful with that word, but drawn into the presence of the Father. And then, of course, the second one is this idea of grace and truth. And we're going to hear that about 4 times here in this prologue, where he talks about we talk about going from grace to grace, and that Jesus's grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So the gospel is Patriarch Athenagoras made the observation that theology is a celebration of truth. So the gospel is the revelation of truth, and the truth is nothing less than agape, and agape, love, is nothing less than Christ himself. So the truth that we're talking about, and we'll see this with Pontius Pilate very explicitly when he says, what is truth? He's asking the wrong question. Truth is who? And Christ is that truth. But we'll get to that. I'm foreshadowing a little bit. And I think that's it for kind of an introduction. Any questions? I don't see any questions on there. Anything from you guys? So we will, and it might be a short lesson. No, we're already 20 minutes in, so we're good. We will, we're not going to get through the whole first chapter today. What we're going to try and get through is going to be what's called the prologue, so verses 1 through 18. And the reason for that is, well, because it's a lot of work, but also because you'll see how dense this is. And this is really considered probably one of the most virtuoso pieces of all of scripture, certainly, but of literature almost in general. I mean, just the skill of the writing and just how it's woven together is really quite remarkable. There's a couple of places where the language kind of leaps out at you, but there's something wrong. People even, when he talks about John the Baptist, they think that maybe that was inserted because it just doesn't fit the same flow. But whatever the case may be, like I said, it's very dense. I could do this whole class just on the very first verse and not exhaust everything there's to say about it. And that brings me to kind of my last point about the introduction is when we did the Gospel of Luke, we did the Gospel of Matthew, right?
Right.
And then I've done the Gospel of Mark, but I don't think I've done it in this parish. So this is the kind of the last of the 4 Gospels. So we'll do it, but not that I did an exhaustive study on those others, but I did what I would at least consider a fairly complete Bible study on those. We're not going to get a complete Bible study on John. John's the kind of book that you can read 100 times and still just be completely overwhelmed with new insights and an encounter with Christ. It's a rather extraordinary piece of writing. And the funny thing for me is looking at the patristic commentaries. I actually did giggle out loud when I was doing it because there's this kind of sobriety when they're writing usually. There's kind of almost a very elevated formal kind of language. And you're reading St. Gregory of Nazianzus, St. John Chrysostom, and they're talking, there's something very magisterial in the way they approach things. And then you get to their commentary on St. John, they're like, we get to talk about St. John. St. John's really great. We just think he's amazing. Can you imagine what it would have been like to be flying at the heights of theology and to be gazing down upon the earth and understanding the depth of the mystery and all this? And they're like little kids in a candy factory. They're like, we get to read John. We get to read John. And I love it. But I think that that's a testament to the character of this writing. And my hope, and of course, I will probably do it to one degree or another. I won't be entirely successful, but my hope is to try to instill some of that in you, is to help you to be able to see and understand what it was that the church fathers just got so giddy excited like little school children when they got to start talking about the Gospel of John. And it truly is. Remember, in the Orthodox Church, there are 3 saints who are considered theologians. There's Saint John the theologian, who's the evangelist. Then there's Saint Gregor the theologian, and then Saint Simeon the new theologian. So there's only 3 saints within the life of the church that have been declared saints. There's saint. There's been named saints. Look at these comments on here. Yep, Stephanie, you're right. It was most scholars agree it was written towards the end of the first century. So yeah, about 90, between 90 and 100. So 96 AD would be good enough. That's close enough. Um, so theologian in Orthodoxy doesn't mean somebody who studied the Bible. Some people would say, oh, Father's a theologian. He's got a master's of divinity, and he's going back to school and he's learning more. So he's a theologian of the church. But we use that word in a very technical way. In a technical way, meaning that they've actually encountered and beheld the Logos, the God himself, in an intimate way. So they've laid at the breast, or at the bosom is kind of the imagery that we use. So because John, of all four evangelists, is called the theologian, it puts a different sort of weight on this gospel, if that makes sense. That this is almost, the others are kind of talking about this eyewitness account, but now we're almost getting this intimate backstage pass to who Jesus is and to what his ministry was about. So like I said, the John's gospel typically is less interested in events as it is in the meaning behind those events. So we're going to get, like, he doesn't talk about, this is all he talks about for his birth. He doesn't talk about the transfiguration. He doesn't talk about the mystical supper. He doesn't talk about the nativity. And even when he talks about for theophany, about the baptism, it's like one line. He says, okay, you got baptized, and then, everything's good, and it moves on. So he assumes we know about those events. It's very clear from his writing that assumption is that people understood those events. But he is emphasizing the meaning and what those events announced and demonstrated about the person of God. Okay? Good. We're all set? Wonderful. And we're off. In archi no logos, que no logos in proston theon, que agape, no, sorry, que theos in logos. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The very first line. Now, like I said, I could spend the whole time talking about just that one line. It's a really magisterial way of opening the gospel, and it's really quite striking. So the very first thing is anarchy, in the beginning. So what does that call to mind right away?
Genesis.
Yeah, everybody. I mean, doesn't take a degree to figure out. It says, oh, Genesis, and that's very purposeful. So the very first thing he does is he's bringing us back to creation. So our mind needs to be in Genesis as we're reading the beginning of this. And some of the themes and the imagery, kind of one of the reasons I'm preaching through Old Testament stories right now is because if you didn't understand, if you didn't read this, in the beginning was the Word, and all of a sudden your mind didn't get flooded with, and the Spirit was hovering over the waters, and the darkness was being held at bay, and then God separated the light from the dark, and then he made the domes and the heavens and the earth, and then he made the earth brought forth plants, the seas brought forth living beings, and then all of a sudden humans were created, and then the whole story of Adam and Eve and the 7 days of creation and all this stuff. If that doesn't all of a sudden flood into the front of your mind so that it's really forefront in your thinking as you're reading this, you're going to misread it. And so all those images need to be, that's where our biblical literacy becomes important. And I'll tell you what, like I said, I've been in a class, I had Father Stephen help us do this whole class on exegesis. I've got all these commentaries, and I've read this gospel numerous times, and this was the first time, if you look at this, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, we'll talk about it next week, but right after the prologue, you have the testimony of John, and then it says, the next day, he saw Jesus coming toward him and said, behold, the Lamb of God. So that's the next day. And then it says, the next day, again, John was standing with two of his disciples and said, the Lamb of God. The two disciples heard him and went after him. That's a third day. Then it says, the next day, and Nathanael and Philip come along. So that's a fourth day. Then it says, and then 3 days later, he's at the wedding of Cana. What's 4 plus 3? 7. So if you just started talking about in the beginning, so our minds should be filled with Genesis, and then all of a sudden we talk about a 7-day period, what's in your mind? Creation. It's the whole story of creation, right? And what happened on the 7th day? So it's the Sabbath, right? So you have God rest on the 7th day. So the wedding at Cana has to be read with echoes of Sabbath in the back of your mind, right? Which I would have never thought to do. And I'm really honestly not even sure what to do with it now, But that For us, it's not normal for us to read the gospel that way. But for the people it was written for, and really for the church through the ages, I mean, the church fathers did it this way. They would have said, oh, in the beginning, creation, 7 days. So they would have read this as the natural continuation of God's process of creation. As a matter of fact, St. Maximus goes to the point of saying Christ would have become incarnate even if humanity hadn't fallen in the garden, because this is the kind of crescendo of creation and the completion of creation. So this needs to be read. Really, the entire gospel needs to be read as an extension of God's work of creation. And usually what we do is we begin to read the gospels as a story of redemption and a story of salvation, but we forget that it's also a continuation of creation. So creation isn't really completed until Christ on the cross, because then that culminates the effort of God to create and to draw us into his communion and into his life. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind. So like I said, the very first line we talk all day about, but the very first thing it's saying is think of creation. Think of the 7 days of creation. Think about Genesis. Have that in your mind. Get those themes. So here's, I was thinking about how do I describe this today. So one of the images that people use for the Gospel of St. John is a symphony. And an overture and a symphony is kind of that first movement of music. And all the themes that are going to be expanded on over the course of the symphony kind of enter into the overture. You get little hints of it, a measure or two of a tune or a melody that's going to carry out into, part of one of the movements of the whole symphony. So you get these little foreshadowing glimpses of what the whole story is going to be in this opening movement. Well, the music affects how we're going to hear the story. So the silly example I came up with is if you go to see a movie and you're looking out on this beautiful beach and the ocean and the waves kicking in, and all of a sudden the music comes on, it's going dun 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 dun. You're going, where are the sharks? It's going to completely affect the way you see that scene. Whereas if you have, I don't know, some music from High School Musical or something, then you're going to think a bunch of kids are going to come down and have a bonfire, and they're going to have a nice, joyful little social occasion. But there's not going to be any sharks coming up on the beach. So the music helps you to rightly see the scene. So if we have the wrong music, if it's really a High School Musical show, but we're playing Jaws music in our head, we're going to have wrong expectations of that scene, and it's not going to sound right. So by the same token, when we read the Gospel of John, we have to have the right music. The overture has to be harmonizing with the other resonances that John's pulling into it. So for instance, part of the overture of John, part of this prologue, these first 18 verses, you need to have strands of creation. The melody of creation has to be harmonizing with that music. Does that make sense? So that's what's happening with this first verse. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Why the past tense was? Is that what it's in? Well, not is.
Enarchy, yeah, I mean, yes, because you're talking about a temporal occasion. And the church fathers talk about this all over the place. They talk about beginning can mean many things, right? The beginning, but what it means here is there was nothing before this. So they're not really saying it in an imperfect sense that as soon as it began. What they're saying is at the very first point of time, this is what existed. Now it's very interesting because in Genesis, in the beginning, what existed? What do we know? How close were you paying attention on Sunday? God, right? Meaning God began to created heaven and earth, and the darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit hovered over the deep. Right. Now, you can recognize, of course, God is Holy Trinity, which we would, of course, read back into it. But as far as the text goes in Genesis, you have God, you have the deep, the darkness, and then this Spirit hovering, which is a little bit ambiguous. So you actually have God and chaos, nothingness, which we talk about in church, but I don't want to get too drawn into that. So in the beginning, that's what was there. That was it. So now what happens when John brings it out? And here's what the point is, not the past tense of it.
The word, yeah.
Right? So now you're saying what was there in that beginning was not just God and then the deep with the darkness over the face of the deep, but also the Word was there. So the world is pre-existent. The Word, not the world, the Word is pre-existent and has always been with the Father. And then in Revelation, he goes so far as to say that the Lamb who's crucified before the foundation of the world, so the Word was crucified, present with God before creation, which is a really interesting thing to contemplate and think about. Now, there is some grammatical things here, though, that you do really want to catch on to. So in the Greek, which I did because we had to memorize this for our biblical Greek class in seminary. I can still remember it. So in archi in logos, which is in the beginning was the Word. Okay, logos in proston theon, and the Word was with God, in the presence of God. Ke theos in logos. And the Word was God, but theos does not have a definite article. It doesn't say o theos logos. It says theos logos. And there's a big argument the Church Fathers addresses every single one of them because the Gnostic Arians said, aha, it means the Word was a God. Because usually if you have an anarthrous article, an anarthrous subject, which means it doesn't have a definite article, in Greek, if it's not the table, it means a table. But that's actually not the right way of understanding it. It's a little bit more complex than that. And this is actually a very tightly crafted sentence in Greek. It's a very, again, it's magisterial in what he does with it. So what it says is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was as God is. So, and that's absolutely a amplification of that. But what it's saying is that the Word shares essentially in the character and nature of God, but is distinct from God himself. If you said o theos in o logos, what you'd be saying is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God himself.
Yeah.
And now you don't have this distinction of Father and Son. Notice in the Church Fathers talk about this too. They go with, I think St. John Chrysostom goes, do you see his restraint? He doesn't say Father and Son because then we would have objects in our mind, but he talks about Word and God so that he gradually introduces us into the mystery of the Holy Trinity. And they really have a deep sense of just how careful and precise John was writing. Because if he'd said anything else there, it would have introduced wrong thinking into us. But what he's done very carefully is he said the Word, which pre-exists, which is a divine attribute, by the way. So the Word pre-exists with God, and he is God in the sense that he has divine nature, but he is not coterminous. He's not the same as God. So Trinitarian theology is hard. It's just weird. And it's really hard to articulate and to expect it in the first line of the gospel. They call it primitive Trinitarianism. They haven't articulated this stuff. This stuff wasn't articulated until 325 years later. But right there, knowing how to read it, you can see that John already had a grasp of the Word, Jesus Christ, being of the same nature as God the Father, and yet distinct and separate. So all this language we came up with, the Chalcedonian definition, is already present right there in the first line. I told you I could go the whole time on one line, didn't I? So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So really this is talking about intimate closeness. This is talking about how the Greek perichoresis, this kind of circular dance of love where they're all kind of interconnected and interpenetrated. That's what's going on from the very first line. He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. So now we're placing him back into the activity and the life of creation. So the Word was there. And by the way, Church Fathers, when they read Genesis, they see the Trinity in the first 3 verses. God the Father, right? In the beginning, God created, and the Spirit hovered over the face of the deep. So there's the Holy Spirit. And then God said, let there be light. So Word. And we probably should talk about that a little bit too. The Church Fathers go on and on and on I loved it. I got this, and usually, like I said, these ancient Christian commentaries are about that thick. They're about half as thick. But this, so 57 pages is just on these 18 verses, and that's all the citations in the Fathers when they said about it. They spend 20 pages talking about just the significance of the word. So word is very interesting. To use logos, logos, to use this word, has a richness in it that we miss out on. And some people even would talk about, Kelly said that a lot of the people she grew up around thought that when it says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, it's talking about the Bible, right? Because the Word of God, the Bible's the Word of God. And they completely didn't realize we're talking about Jesus. But this word, the word, has a very Hellenistic context. It also has a very Jewish kind of Hebrew context, and then of course it becomes this Christian context. So the first one is in, and I'll use my notes from class, but I'm not going to go into them as extensive as they are. So you have, let me get to where he's talking about the different kinds. So the Hellenic understanding of logos. Logos was I'm not going to spend too much time looking for it. So in Greek, a logos could mean a word, although lexi is probably used more often, but logos could mean a word, like a spoken word, but it usually also meant rationality, reason, but also, and this is, I hope I can get this right because this really helps to understand logos. Logos is a pattern of meaning. So the logos of a table is it encompasses its whole function and purpose and what it's supposed to be. And so if you are true to your logos, it kind of means that you are meeting your essential being. You're doing what you're supposed to do. And so a lot of Greek philosophy talks about logos and then the logos of creation. One of the ways of thinking about it, is, if you study Eastern religions, is Taoism. The Tao is kind of this eternal principle that undergirds all of creation. And if you go with the flow, then you're in the Tao. And if you don't, you're opposing the Tao. My spiritual father, when he ministered in Hong Kong, they had a Torii gate over the entrance to the church. And the Torii gate said, and the Tao became flesh. And when Taoists would come there, they look and they go, oh yeah, it's Taoism. They say it's a Tao temple. They say, no, it's a Christian temple. They go, oh, but it says that right there. He says, read it again. And they go, wait, that can't be true. The Tao is a principle. It's not a person. So that's what's going on here. When he said, oh, logos, the word was God, he's tapping into this Hellenistic understanding of word as being this rational principle which undergirds creation, which is the pattern and the meaning of each thing. There's a book by Roger Zelazny, which I loved, called The Chronicles of Amber. And it's a story, it's a science fiction fantasy story, so don't get too caught up in it, but it's really a fascinating story about these interdimensional kind of family of royalty. And there's a pattern, literally a labyrinth at their castle at the center of the dimensions. And if they're able to walk that pattern, they gain the ability to move in shadows, which means that there's these infinite iterations of creation, shadows of this original world, and Earth, of course, being one of them. So they can move between these kind of dimensions because they've learned the pattern. That, as weird as that sounds, that's always been one of the most helpful, science fiction stories I've read for understanding this, because if you can think of the logos as the pattern of creation, and then it's easy to think about that as a disembodied philosophical abstraction. And then to say that that very principle of creation, that very pattern of being, that very meaning of the universe then becomes a person, you'll capture something of how shocking this first phrase is. In Archina logos, and logos in prostotheantheos in logos, that the word, well, when we get to the word, became flesh. That's what's, how can the principle of meaning of the universe become flesh? But it's really important to have that in your head as we go forward in this, because the claim of John's gospel isn't that some sort of divine being that had, superpowers came in and saved us by resurrecting from the dead, but that the very meaning and fullness of creation itself was somehow enfleshed and lived among us so that we could interact and be in relationship with, which is a really striking thing. So that's the Greek side of it. The Hebrew side of it, bara, I'm probably not pronouncing it right at all, but word is not it's not an abstract thing. It denotes activity and action. A word accomplishes something. So like the 10 Commandments would be speaking because they accomplished something, if that makes any sense. So again, it becomes a very active thing when you start talking about the word. And then the final thing is just the aside from kind of the metaphors that this captures, is just think about what a word is. And the church fathers really dwell on this a lot, that a word makes the invisible visible, right? So my thoughts and my emotions, my heart, are invisible. But when I speak forth a word, it reveals my heart and my thoughts. And so this immaterial kind of mental process going on becomes incarnate through the words that I speak. And just in the same way, the invisible God has a movement within himself. So we have the words embodied in our minds before we actually give breath to the actual consonantal word, the vocalization. In the same way, Jesus, the Son, the Word of God, pre-existed within his mind. Again, these are metaphors, before he was breathed out into creation and became incarnate. So all those images are wrapped up in Logos. And I know I've really dwelt on it for a long time. We might not even get to the first 18 verses, but it's really important. Like I said, this very first verse, if we read it carefully, and if we understand how it properly resonates with Genesis and how it resonates with the thought world of the people who wrote this and read this, it's going to give us a key for understanding the entire gospel. So we have to kind of get oriented the right way to understand this so that it then does properly color the way that we read this. So creation in the back of your head, this idea that the pattern of all things is at play here and has pre-existed and is somehow related to God. And then everything that was made through him. So he was the agent of creation. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So this idea, a lot of this dualism, you're going to see a lot. John speaks in very dualistic terms. So you've got, life and death. You have light and dark. We'll find some others here too. But I want you to think this light and darkness, and again, this is something that I missed a little bit, but what's really important about the darkness is when God created, remember, go back to Genesis, when he created heaven and earth, what was lurking there that the Spirit had to hover over? Darkness. Right? Darkness was covering the deep. So those are kind of your two enemies, although it's not clear that they're separate, but you have darkness and deep are kind of these metaphors for non-existence, for chaos that opposes creation. So it's anti-creation. So this idea of darkness is talking about the entropy, this kind of tendency towards chaos and disruption, which is the enemy of existence. So keep in your mind, anytime you hear about the deep, anytime you hear about darkness, think non-existence trying to overtake us and consume us. And so God's whole purpose in creation is to make existence. And so what's opposing him is this non-existence. It's not a competing God. It's not an entity. It's not a yin-yang. It's none of that. It's that there is dissolution and non-existence. God is that which truly exists, on Yahweh, that which exists.
Warmth versus coldness.
You could put it in those terms. I'm not. I mean, you'll get those kinds of images, but it really is I mean, especially in a scientific sense, that warmth is movement of molecules, and then coldness is absence, right? So there's no movement. But it's really about existence and non-existence. Our enemy was never sin. Our enemy really isn't death, unless death is a cipher, a symbol for nothingness, for non-existence. So that's the saying. Saying non-existence is trying to overtake life, but it cannot, because God is life itself. So it's a beautiful image. It works really well as a metaphor. It's amazing, because if I take a candle and stick it in the middle of the room, and I look at the darkness and say, go ahead and put out the candle, the darkness, it can't. You can't increase darkness, and I've talked about this with people when in confession, they talk about, I have to stop doing bad things. Well, you don't become holy. You can't go get, if a room is too dark, you can't go get bucketfuls of darkness and take it out. You can't bail out darkness, right? You can't actually take away darkness. What you can do is walk in the room with a candle, and that candle will dispel darkness. That's why this image of Christ being the light is so prevalent in John, because our salvation isn't about us combating the darkness. We can't. The darkness will overcome us and dissolve us in nothingness. It's about clinging to the light, which casts off darkness, and darkness cannot overcome the light. Light can overcome darkness. You bring a light into a room, but if we have these lights on there and somebody walks in here with a bucket of darkness and opens it up, the darkness isn't going to overcome the light. It can't defeat it. So that image is there. That image is that non-existence cannot overcome existence. Only life can overcome death, but not the other way around. Although it sounds strange to our ears, but if you follow along, you'll get what it's saying. And this is kind of a little bit of an abrupt transition. It's very this poetic, lyrical. In him was life. The life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness. The darkness has not overcome it. There was this guy, and so some scholars will say this was inserted in there, but I'm not sure I agree with that, because what he's doing is he's setting up the gospel from here. Okay. Now, prevalent within this thought world too, you have to understand that there was something called Manichaeism, and there was this idea. Well, Manichaeism is a separate thing that came out of it, but there were people who thought that John was the messianic figure, and that Jesus was kind of a secondary figure.
You mean John the Baptist? Not
John, yeah. So we can get to talk about John the Baptist right now in this verse, and it actually makes a lot of sense. Okay, John the Baptist showed up on the scene first. He baptized Jesus. It was his disciples that formed the core of Jesus' following, and then Jesus' ministry didn't really start until John had died and been executed, and Jesus looked to him for what's what I'm looking for a signal to begin his ministry. So any reasonable person looking at that set of evidence would say, Jesus is continuing the ministry that John began. So John is the founder, John the Baptist is the founder, and Jesus is just the generation that then carried it forward to its fruition, right? And that problem was actually present in the world. There were people who thought that John was the one and Jesus was just his chief disciple. And so because of this, and it was actually competing in the time that John wrote his gospel, you see a very strong use of John the Baptist saying, I'm not the guy, I'm not the guy, I'm not the guy, that's the guy, that's the guy, that's the guy. We're going to see it, for this next chapter, we see it all over the place. And actually, John the evangelist never says that John the Baptist baptized Jesus. When we read it, let's read it carefully.
State that again.
So John, the writer of the gospel, when we read this, we're going to get to it in about 20 verses, never says that John the Baptist baptized Jesus. It just says that John the Baptist said, when you were baptized, I heard this voice. But he never says, when I baptized you, or at the baptism of Jesus by John. He very carefully sidesteps that, so it can't be, so he minimizes that evidence. And then John, of course, kept saying, he's coming after me, but he's greater than me. So he's all this, a lot of this writing is based on counteracting this misunderstanding of the place of John the Baptist.
That was occurring during his time.
That was occurring during his time, which for us is the big issue, because that's died out. And nobody think, okay, now we understand John's place and everything. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came for testimony to bear witness to the light, this is Jesus, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness to the light. Okay, so this theme of light has been carried through. So we know we're talking about the Logos. And notice all the images that John uses. He hasn't said anything about Jesus yet. He hasn't said anything about the Messiah yet. But he's using these images to prepare us, to walk us into it. So there's a man sent from God whose name was John. He came for testimony, to bear witness to the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness to the light. And that's going to happen in verse 19. And this is the testimony of John who's bearing witness to the light. The true light that enlightens every man was coming into the world. Now, here's the first place that we get to this very interesting use of a universal pronoun or whatever. You notice he doesn't say what you would expect. The true light that enlightens Israel was coming into the world. That's what you would expect. But it doesn't say that. The true light that enlightens every man was coming into the world. So in the context of John, in historical criticism tries to say, oh, well, they wrote this way because of that. But you have John was writing within a Semitic community, not as strongly as Matthew was, of course, but he's writing within a Jewish context. And so this expectation would be that he's talking to the Jews. But what he ends up doing is using this kind of universal language to say that what had happened was that God had intended to save creation and all humanity through the Jewish nation, through Israel, but they failed to do that. So now Christ has come in his person to do the work of Israel and offer salvation to the whole world. And we're going to find this when he talks about the Jews, and they'll pop up right in verse 18. There's the word Jew comes from Judea, which means the people who lived in Judah. So at first it just meant the two tribes that lived in southern Israel. Then it became a description for all those who worshiped at the temple after the exile, after the loss of the 10 tribes. And then it was extended out to basically mean all of those who worship God after the Old Testament, or after the Hebrew scriptures, whatever you want to call it. By the time John starts using the word Jew, what he means is those people of Israel who rejected Christ as Messiah. So the Jews are those who they're in contradistinction to the Christians. Not that he had a sense that it was a separate faith or religion. He didn't. He sees Christianity as the true Judaism, or the true Israel. But the Jews then becomes a term to denote those Israelites who did not recognize Jesus as Messiah. So a lot of people will try to use John to develop an anti-Semitic theology. So it's important to kind of get that grounding before we move forward. He says some pretty terrible things about Jews, but what he's saying is the people who rejected the Messiah, not that ethnic group of people from Israel. So he was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world knew him not. And this is why John writes very poetically, but sometimes it can be confusing. Because he knew the world, but the world didn't know him, and it was formed through the world, and the world and everything that was made not. And you kind of go, ah. So read it slowly and think about what John is telling us. He was in the world, and the world was made through him. So all of creation reflects Christ. He made it. And yet the world knew him not. This is the first hint we get that's going to be one of the major themes of the gospel, is that the people who were supposed to recognize Christ, the people that were promised the Messiah, failed to recognize the Messiah. Everybody's calling me going to a Bible study. He came to his own home. It actually says he came to Taivia. He came to his own stuff, and his own people received him not. He's talking about Israel. Okay. So he came to his own home. He came to the people who had been prepared for him for 2,000 years, and his own people received him not. But to all, that universal phrase, to all who received him, so that's everybody, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God. And by the way, it's not sons of God. We're not using gender inclusive language here. He doesn't say ii to theu. He's not talking about the sons of God. He says tekna to theo, so it's children. He never refers to Christians as sons of God. It's always tekna, children of God. The only reference to son of God is always Jesus Christ as the Son of God. So he actually uses, he's very precise, again, he's very precise in his language. So he is being very careful to say that we are given the opportunity to be adopted to God, but not in the same way that Jesus is the Son of God. Because, and that's one of the themes, they're not going to get it. The disciples aren't going to understand that. They're going to struggle through that. We still struggle with it to a degree, but it's important that we understand that we have the power, I'll just use the language here, we have the power to become children of God, but we do not have the ability to become the only begotten Son of God, which is an important distinction. So all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And so this is just backing through kind of our sense of, or at least the ancient sense of how babies were made, right? So blood is the biological process. You know, it's not just knit together blood. And by the way, they thought that babies were formed by blood coagulating around the male seed in the woman. You know, they didn't really understand ovulation and fertilization and zygotes and ovum and all that other kind of stuff. So they thought that literally babies were formed from the blood of the mother, that somehow the seed of the father was then, I don't know exactly what the mechanism, but so he's saying, look, you know, you think that people are made from this biological process of gestation and giving a baby, but that's not it. And okay, well, maybe that's not it, but they're made because, you know, people got really excited by each other and they had, you know, they went and they followed the lust of the flesh, you know, the desire of the flesh. No, that wasn't even it either. Oh, well, parents decided they wanted to have children, and so then they made the choice, the will of man to go have a child, and so then that started the process. No. So he keeps backing it up. He says, you think it's because it's a biological process, but no, it's even earlier than that. Oh, it's because they got excited. No. It's even before the intimacy of sexual activity. Oh, okay, well, then it's the actual conscious decision that they decide they want to have children. Well, no, actually, it's even more than that. We are born not of the biological processes, not because we procreate, but because of God. Our chance to be born into true existence is not of blood, the will of the flesh, or the will of man, but of God. No comments. Okay. So now we get to this beautiful phrase, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. We have beheld his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father. Now that is a remarkable phrase. And because what we talked about before, so I'm not going to go through that again, but just the idea of the Word becoming flesh is a striking, ridiculous claim that would have really, everybody would have gone, whoa, I'm going to have to think through this. This doesn't make sense. How does the rational pattern and undergirding kind of meaning of the universe become a person? It makes no sense. To which the Christian answer is, of course it doesn't. That's why we worship it. You know, we can't make sense of it, so we just fall down at the mystery of God, and we worship the Word become flesh. Now, this word dwelt among us means to tabernacle among us, or to dwell, to be intented among us, to be living in a tent among us. So now we're drawing into the idea, we're drawing in resonances from Exodus. You know, that the Shekinah, the glory of God, came and dwelt among the people within the tent of meeting, the tabernacle. So that language again throws us right back into that story. So now the story of Exodus has to come into our minds and think about God tenting among us. But this is different because now it's this permanent residence in a person made of flesh and blood. Now, one of the places where I really had to stop when I was researching for tonight is the church fathers. Every single one of them, when they comment on this passage, said that, you know, Jesus, in taking on flesh, became clothed with death, which is really fascinating to me. And it's not so much that he was taking on life is that he was making himself subject to death. And the Word, the pre-existent Word, the second person of the Holy Trinity, who called into being everything that was and nothing that was, without him, nothing that was. All this kind of poetic language that he's using, yet the world knew him not. The world was made through him. All things were made through him. Without him, it was not made anything that was made. All this stuff. God, the Word is life itself. The Word is already life. So he doesn't become clothed with life. What he does is by becoming incarnate, he makes himself subject to death and non-being. It's almost as if the Holy Spirit is guarding the Trinity from the darkness and the deep, from this chaos. And Jesus decides to slip the fence and leave the protection of the hovering Spirit and make himself subject and vulnerable to death. And every one of the fathers, they said, here's Christ taking on death. This is and you're talking about, what is that verse? My eyes are going bad. You're talking about verse 14. So you're 14 verses into the gospel, and you're already talking about Jesus being vulnerable to death for our salvation. Because how can life die? Again, the darkness can't overcome the light. So the light had to enter into a realm where darkness could pursue it so that the light could then defeat the darkness. So we already have this, we're kind of having the gospel already kind of being unraveled and laid out in front of us just by saying the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So God became vulnerable to death and came and lived among us. Now, full of grace and truth. Grace and truth is very interesting because grace becomes it's a hard word, and I have to admit I'm a little bit confused by it before I started studying. So grace for us in Orthodox, we've always understood as this way of talking about the very interior life of God, the Holy Trinity. So within the Holy Trinity, the life of the Holy Trinity we call grace. It's not an intermediate, it's not a created thing, it's not an intermediary between us and God. It's actually the code that we use to describe the interior life of God. And because we can be in communion with Jesus, because he took on flesh and dwelt among us, now we have access indirectly to that interior life of God. We cannot be God by nature, but we can participate in him through grace, which is his life. Now, that's a very technical understanding that developed later, and it doesn't seem that at least the fullness of that understanding is at operation here. As a matter of fact, the most compelling commentary that I read wanted to argue that grace here has kind of its original meaning of just a freely offered gift, that it doesn't have that theological content in it yet. And so then what it becomes is the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, a full gift of truth, which seems to me to fit better the flow of what's happening. To say that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So now, again, I don't want to get too philosophical. This is hard to understand. If I'm sounding confusing, forgive me. I'm doing my best. But this is very rich and deep and abstract in a lot of ways. It gets easier after verse 18. I promise you, next week it gets more narrative, and we get to talk about the Lamb of God walking down the street and Andrew wanting to go hang out with him and have dinner, and then inviting his friends over, and people, under fig trees or no, not fig trees. What is he under?
Yeah.
Is it a fig tree,
Yes.
Nathaniel? You under the fig tree? Anyway, so this idea of the Word being the pattern of meaning of the universe, being the real truth of the universe, now taking on flesh and dwelling among us. So the actual fullness of the truth of God is now right there in our midst for us to have a relationship with. So truth, not as an idea, but is now incarnate as a person, we can now have a relationship and enter into the fullness of the pattern of creation. I don't think I can say it any better than kind of using poetic, lyrical language, but it's beautiful. We have beheld his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father. Now that word glory, doxa, is a very loaded term, because now we're echoing Exodus 32. So all these things should be playing in our heads, but we just, like I said, we don't have a scriptural imagination. We're going to develop that, though. That's what I want to do this year in the church. But when we talk about the glory, we're thinking of this point where right after Moses basically saved the Israelites from God's wrath and said, don't wipe them all out. Okay, we're going to go make another set of 10 commandments after they worship the golden calf. They go up in the mountain, and Moses says, hey, can I see your glory? And God says, you can't look on my face and live, but I'm going to stick you in a corner of a rock. And when I walk past you, you can turn around and look, and you can see me as I go past you. And Moses says, okay. And he walks by and he says, behold, the Lord your God, who's long-suffering and great in mercy and everything else. And Moses looks out and sees the back parts of God. We understand that to be a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, that Christ is who walked past Moses, but he couldn't look on his face yet. And then we have the transfiguration, which of course John doesn't record, when Moses and Elijah actually look upon the face of Christ in the uncreated light of Mount Tabor, and now we see him in his full glory. So what we're saying, so right here, John is actually already intimating what happened at the transfiguration. He's saying because God became incarnate, we can now look upon Jesus, the incarnate Word of God, and behold the glory of God. Remember, glory in Hebrew is kabod, and it doesn't mean an opinion or a thought or a good reputation, though those images are there, and they're primary when we talk about doxa. But kabod is a weighty, substantial presence of something. So the glory of something is its real, tangible, substantial presence. So if you talk about the glory of God in the face of Christ, you can see how all that wraps in. So now the truth, the logos, which is the meaning of the universe, the truth of the universe, became flesh, made himself vulnerable to death, and lived among us as his people so we could look upon him and see his substantial, real presence as God. In one verse. John bore witness to him and cried. Again, seems a little bit abrupt, but it's already setting the stage to make sure that we understand the place of John within this whole narrative. John bore witness to him and cried, this was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, for he was before me. That was one of the main arguments for John's supremacy, is John was older, 6 months older, and he came first and he inaugurated the ministry, so Jesus just continued it. And he's saying, no, he might be behind me, and it's a play on words in Greek. He might be behind me spatially, geographically, but he is in front, or even chronologically, but he's in front of me as far as status and position go. And then this very striking last bit of the phrase, he who comes after me ranks before me, for he was before me. And so now this is again a reference to the eternal procession, or the eternal existence. I gotta be careful with the words I use. It's not procession, that's for the Holy Spirit. But for the eternal existence, the pre-existence of the Word. And from his fullness, we're back to talking about Jesus, and from his fullness have we all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. The only Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, has made him known. So now, this is a tough verse. And the church fathers, a couple of them talk about this grace upon grace. Charis anti charis. Antes it's a preposition, is that what you call it? It means instead of, or in the place of. And it can mean other things. Greek's a little bit more fluid. But grace upon grace is really more of it's a little bit more of a reach for the translation. So a lot of people are uncomfortable with that, but they just don't really know how to read this. So St. John Chrysostom St. Augustine goes on and on about how, well, first you have to have the grace to believe, and then once you believe, then the grace of living, then justification by grace and faith and everything that gets added to that. So you're getting grace added upon grace. I'm not real convinced about it. Some of the, the Eastern fathers, like St. John Chrysostom, they don't really talk about that grammatical construction, which makes me think they must have read it a little bit differently. But like I said, that same commentary that talked about grace being used in a more primitive sense without that technical content of talking about the inner life of the Holy Trinity, that it's more the sense of this freely offered gift that's presented to us without really having a technical sense of the content of that gift. And if you read it that way, it sounds a little bit different. So you say, from his fullness we have all received. So from the fullness of Jesus, the completeness of Jesus, we've all received grace in the place of a gift in the place of a gift. Okay, that doesn't really help us. But then if we read this next part, you have two gifts listed. The law was given through Moses. Grace and truth, or the gift of truth, if we're going to keep translating it that way, the gift of truth came through Jesus Christ. Okay, well, maybe that does make sense, because so if you're saying that the fullness of Christ gave a fuller gift in the place of a previous gift, that previous gift is the law given to Moses, which served as a custodian, although that's a word from Paul, that's not a word from John, but it served as a custodian until the fullness of God came within the glory of the face of Christ. Now it starts making a little bit more sense. So that the law pointed us in the direction of Christ, or points in the direction of salvation, if you want to use those kinds of terms, points in the direction of salvation. Christ himself is the pathway that allows us to get to that direction. So the first gift we were given, and by the way, there's no indication that one gift replaces the other. It's not instead of, it's really in the place of. So the law was given through Moses, which the law points us to salvation, but the gift of truth came through Jesus Christ. So it's almost like having a road sign saying go that way to paradise, but then there's this huge, massive Grand Canyon chasm, and there's no way across it. So you say, well, we know what direction to go, but we're not able to do it. And then the fullness of the truth, the gift of the truth, being Jesus Christ, became the path across the chasm that allowed us then to travel that path. I think that's probably a more helpful way of thinking about that passage. So from his fullness, from the fullness of the Logos, have we all received grace, a gift in the place of a first gift. For the law was given through Moses, and the gift of truth through Jesus Christ. And this fits in, by the way, with what Christ says. I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law, to complete the law. That anybody who takes out the cross of a T or erases the dot of an I is going to be least in the kingdom of heaven. That none of the law will pass away. But we have to understand the law in the proper context of it providing direction without us actually being able to actualize it because we're just incapable of it. And when Christ came finally and became vulnerable to death, he then opened up to us the way in which we could enter into communion, into salvation that the law had pointed us to. And then the last verse is really a summation of the whole thing. Oh, I didn't even realize how late it was. I'm 15 minutes over. Sorry, everybody. We'll be done in about 2 seconds. We're on the last verse. No one has ever seen God, the only Son who's in the bosom of the Father. He has made him known. So you have the Son in the bosom of the Father. There's where you get that, the intimacy, the closeness, the being bound together. And then this idea of revelation, of the Son being able to reveal the Father by becoming enfleshed and dwelling among us. So the glory and the reality of the Father is now apparent and visible to us as well. I'm sorry I didn't do a good job of paying attention to time. I should have sped up there at the end. But hopefully that was worthwhile. Hopefully you guys have a little bit of the geeky excitement about the Gospel of John that the church fathers had and that I have. But I hope that was helpful. That really is, the prologue, like I said, is this overture. So really the whole gospel was just presented to us that we're going to be reading through for the next year. So if that was a little bit hard to follow, or if that seemed a little bit deep, and it's okay, just bear with me, and come back and watch this video at the end of the year. When we get done with the gospel, come back and maybe this stuff will be a little bit easier to follow along with. And with that, are there any questions? Very good. Great. I will leave it open for a second, but we'll say our prayer, and that way people can carry on with their evenings. I need to learn the hymn for St. John now, don't I?
Yes.
Because I know the one from St. Matthew's the same as St. Luke, but I think John's a different one. It's something about your virginity, and anyway, we'll do the hymn for St. Luke. O holy apostle and evangelist Luke, make intercession to our merciful God, that he grant our souls remission of offenses. Lord Jesus Christ, our God, please send your Spirit to help to translate the words of the gospel and the teachings that we received here today into the groans that are they're too sublime even for the human spirit. Help us to understand your gospel, not through our minds, but through our hearts. Help to translate all the difficulties and the ideas into life-giving, into your life-giving gospel. For your holy name, forever in the ages of ages. Amen.
Amen.
Every time I do something like that, like I offer a hymn to St. Luke and we're doing a gospel of St. John, I'd see him like all up in heaven and St. Luke being like, they say to me and not to you, you know. I was like, be quiet, they did my gospel, you know. Like, I always wonder what that experience is for them. Because I'm sure they're like, hey, look, they're doing my Bible. They're doing mine this year in Bible study. You know? Like, yeah, it'd be pretty cool. Very good. All right. I don't see any more questions. Thank you. You're welcome to everybody. I hope you have a wonderful evening. I'm going to sign off now. God bless you all. Have a wonderful evening. Goodbye.